Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 5 of BUSS420 Project Management. And it seems like I say it every week, but Week 5 is another busy one. We have a number of chapters to read, we have a two-part discussion question, an assignment with Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 problems and discussions, an assignment which is a Microsoft project exercise, our very first installment of the final portfolio project before we wrap up the week with a weekly reflection. Let's get started with our readings for the week. Well, they're the lectures on project management up in our Angel classroom, but in addition to that, we're going to be doing Chapter 9 and Chapter 10, which are all about project scheduling, from networks to duration estimations, critical path, lagging, crashing, and activity networks. Let's take a look at all of these. And let's get started with some basic terminology. Let's start with one of the basic elements of project scheduling, and those are nodes. And these are defining points in a network, or otherwise they could be defined as an activity. And here we have an example of 8 separate activities, A through H. Now we can create relationships between these activities, and one of the very first types we'll talk about is a predecessor relationship. And that's where activities must be completed prior to the initiation of a later activity. And if we connect the nodes in the way that you see here, A is the predecessor of all of the other nodes. B is the predecessor of C through H, and C the predecessor of D through H, and so on. Another type of relationship is that of a successor, an activity that cannot be started until the previous activities have completed. And here we can see that A through G are all the successors of H, and A through F are successors of G, and A through E successors of F, and so on. So when we draw out nodes with relationships, we're creating a project network diagram, which is simply a display of the logical relationships between tasks. And there are really two types. We've been looking at, with all these examples, serial or sequential activities, one happening after the other. But there are also network diagrams with parallel activities. And now that we have an activity diagram, we can define paths, a sequence of activities leading from the beginning to the end. And in a serial or sequential set of activities, there's only one path through the network. But when you have parallel activities, as we have down here below, you could see we have 2 parallel paths that can walk through this entire network. An important concept in project scheduling is critical path, and that's the path through the network with the longest duration. And in a sequential or series of activities, well, there's only one path, therefore by default it's the critical one. But when you have more complicated network diagrams with parallel sets of activities, there will be one path that is the critical path. That is the path through the network with the longest duration when you add them all up for each activity. Now you'll see described in the book that there have been 2 methods of developing a network. There was PERT, the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, and CPM, Critical Path Method. Now these 2 techniques have blended together and are commonly nowadays referred to as a single name, PERT CPM. Another concept described in the book is project estimation, and that is really and truthfully the key to project scheduling accuracy. Now you have a number of different techniques for project estimation. You could base it on experience. I've done something similar in the past. You can bring in experts, again another subjective technique, and then you can have mathematical derivations, and that's more of an objective technique based on optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely estimates of activities. Let's put all this together. And here we have a network diagram, very simple, but with 4 different nodes. And there are 2 paths through the network, A, B, and C. We've done our estimations, and we know that combined A, B, and C is 23 days. And if we take the other path, A, C, and D, well, we add up all those estimations, and we have 24 days. So we're able to identify the critical path as being A, C, D. Now there are some calculations we can do using network diagrams, and one of those is a forward pass, and that's to determine the earliest start and earliest finish time for each activity. Now with the critical path, A, C, D, well, there is no early start and early finish time other than putting them all together. But with the non-critical path, we have that idea of float. We have an extra day to work with. So if we slide that activity B to the beginning, we can identify the earliest time we can get it started and the earliest time it would finish. And when we're determining the backward pass, that's the network calculation to determine the latest finish time for each activity. Again, the critical path is all stacked together, right? That illustration really helps. But with the non-critical path, now we float all of our activities to the back end, so we know the latest time we could possibly get started on B and the latest finish time we can finish it without affecting the critical path. Let's move on and take a look at some of the topics in Chapter 10, such as precedence relationships. And let's take a real-life example that we can all be familiar with, such as renovating a room. We'll need to go and purchase our supplies, then we'll need to prepare like the walls for painting, before we actually do the painting, and then finally preparing the floor with maybe some new carpeting. So if we put all of these activities one right after the other, creating finish to start relationships, the most common type of relationships, we know we have to buy supplies and finish buying supplies before we start prepping the walls. Then we have to finish prepping the walls before we can start painting them. And we have to finish painting the walls before we start installing the carpeting. All finish to start relationships. Now another type of relationship is a finish to finish, and that's where both activities must be completed at the same time. So we'll modify our network diagram to identify that after we buy supplies, we have to tape molding and wash the walls, and both of those have to be finished before we can start painting the walls. Start to start is another type of relationship where both tasks must begin at the same time. And again, we'll change our network diagram where we're buying supplies. And though we'll start buying the putty for the walls and buying the paint at exactly the same time, one might finish before the other. But we start them both at the same time. Start to finish is one of the least common types of relationships, and here we have cleaning tools, which has to and can only start after we finish prepping the walls. Two other terms introduced in Chapter 10 are lag and lead, and let's take a look at each of those. And we'll start with lag, and that's the lag between when we apply the first coat of paint and when we can start applying the second coat of paint. Now, seen from the point of view of the finish of the first coat of paint, we read our instructions on the paint can and it says you have to wait 3 hours before you can apply the second. Therefore, there's a lag introduced of 3 hours between that first activity and the second. And to provide an example of lead, we can take a look at these two activities of ordering the carpet and installing it. From the point of view of installing the carpet, we know there's a 4-day lead time between ordering the carpet and when it arrives before we can actually install it. So that's an example of a 4-day lead time. Now, throughout this video, we've taken a look at network diagrams, and it's a great way to visualize some of the terminology. But there's a very popular diagramming technique known as Gantt charting. So here is a network diagram with our different nodes and paths through that network diagram. And in the late 1800s, a man named Henry Grant came up with another visualization, which is named after him, the Gantt diagram. And here we have exactly the same set of activities with relationships between them. And you can see we can also identify the critical path by coloring each of the bars a different color. Now, the Gantt chart became very popular and is very popular today because it's comprehensive. It incorporates baselines so we can identify change over time. It allows us to update and control the project. We can even identify resources in exactly the same diagram, and it's easy to create and use with programs like Microsoft Project. Another topic in Chapter 10 is that of crashing or crashing a schedule, and that means to accelerate a schedule to end earlier. So if we relate this back to the triple constraints of time, scope, and cost, what we're trying to do when we crash a schedule is to decrease one of those constraints to reduce the time. But that comes at a cost. If we want to reduce the time, well, we can reduce the scope so we have less to do. Either that, or if we want to keep the scope the same, we're going to increase the cost by bringing on additional manpower. So we're making trade-offs between the triple constraints. Well, let's put all of those different topics into use, and we'll start with discussion. And we'll take a look at top-down versus bottom-up budgeting. What is the difference between the two? When would you use one versus the other? And based on your experience, which is most effective and why? And a second part of that will return to crashing a project and what are the different effects this might have on either the budget, and I would suggest, or the scope of the project. And at the end of the week after discussion, we have Assignment 1, which includes Chapter 9 problems and Chapter 10 discussion questions. And please be sure you're answering the right set of questions from the end of each of those chapters. This is due on day 7, which is Saturday by midnight Eastern Time, and you'll post this up as an attachment right there in the Dropbox. Now, the first part asks us to complete Chapter 9 problems 1 through 4. In the first problem, you'll create a sequential or serial task list. Then you'll determine a single estimate based on a PERT calculation, and then determine multiple estimates based on PERT calculations. And in number 4, we'll construct a network diagram for the given set of activities. And here is that example of a network diagram. And for this, you can use any Microsoft program you like. For some of you, using Microsoft Project will be your choice if you dare. Otherwise, you can use Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or anything that draws boxes and arrows. And the second part of this assignment are the Chapter 10 discussion questions 1 through 3. And here you'll provide examples of lag and predecessor relationships. You'll explain how baselines are used with Gantt charts, and then finally describe the advantage of Gantt charts have over PERT or activity diagrams. Our second assignment for the week is around Microsoft Project. This is due on day 7, which is Saturday at midnight Eastern Time, and I expect you to post 2 files up there in the Dropbox. The first file covers activities 10.1, 2, and 3 because they're all interrelated. And you'll have a second schedule for just 10.4, which is to add lag relationships. Now there's a separate coaching video on this exercise, and there are some templates already provided to you in the activity Dropbox. Another activity for this week is, well, the first installment of the final portfolio project, and that is due on day 7, which is Saturday at midnight Eastern Time. And that'll simply be an attachment right there in the Dropbox. Now, what I ask you to do is to open up the Microsoft Word template that was provided in the Week 2 Activities folder and complete all parts of the section Week 5 Initiating a Project. And those include capturing the project overview and documenting the business case or project objectives. Now please refer to the final portfolio rubric when completing this activity. And I explain a lot more in a separate coaching video on just that exercise. So we have another very busy week here in week 5 with 2 chapters to read, a 2-part discussion question, 2 different assignments, and then the first installment of our final portfolio project before you complete the weekly reflection. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me at that email address, or please post something up to an appropriate forum like the questions forum. Thank you all, and let's have a fantastic week.